So, welcome to the SCM National Gathering. I'm very excited to have this conversation. So, obviously, the theme of today's National Gathering is on inner peace and outer pacifism, and looking at the questions that are very pertinent and relevant to the world today, with the number of conflicts and the amount of violence that are currently occurring across the world in multiple different places. And so we want to start our conversation today with just an exploration of different responses to the question of, does Christian peace mean pacifism? So we'll start with just a brief introduction from yourself, so where you're coming from, who you are, and your response to that question. So Teresa, do you want to start us off with that? So does Christian peace mean pacifism?
It's great to be here. Thank you, everyone, for inviting me. I'm here, my name's Teresa Alessandro, and I'm representing Christian CND. Lydia, our outreach worker, is not available, so I've stepped in. I've come from Leicester today, which is not that far. I know some of you have done longer journeys. I agree with Ayla, it's wonderful to be here with so much energy in the room. So, Christian peace, does it mean pacifism? I think I was thinking about this over the last few days. I think for me, it depends what your definition of pacifism might be, as to whether that's what Christian peace is equal to. What I think Christian peace is about, I think it's something active and courageous, and I think that's what Jesus is calling us to, an active and courageous way of making peace in the world. And so I'm inspired by somebody called Walter Wink. I don't know if people know Walter Wink. Dead now, but he did some fantastic work, and what's really stayed with me from his work that guides me in my thinking about active and courageous peace is the story when Jesus speaks to his disciples about turning the other cheek, and sometimes that has been understood as a kind of becoming a doormat, let terrible things happen to you, because the most important thing is not to react with violence. But what Walter Wink explained that I think that has really changed my life is that when Jesus is telling that, giving that instruction to the disciples, he's saying if someone strikes you on your right cheek, turn the other cheek. So first of all, he's not saying don't do anything, and he's not saying hit them back, and he's not saying grovel. He's giving them something active that they can do in response. And what's courageous about it is that in those times when Jesus was speaking to those disciples, they were a people oppressed by the Romans. And striking someone on the right cheek, if you're right-handed and you want to strike someone on their right cheek, you're going to do that, which is a kind of backhanded slap, which is a kind of dismissive, casual violence that an oppressor would use against someone they are oppressing, that a master would use against a slave, like that. And what Jesus was saying is, if you're in that position, turn the other cheek to that person, your left cheek. Now, if they want to strike you on your left cheek as well, they're going to have to do an open-handed slap. And in doing that, they're suddenly not a master exerting their authority that some people might think was right. Suddenly there's somebody who is using violence to get their own way. And in doing that, Jesus is telling us that you are exposing that person as a person of violence, as a person who is hurting others in order to get what they want. And I think there's something there about you're exposing them, and also you're exposing them to themselves. You're confronting them with who they are. And that is a way to begin changing hearts and minds. So for me, I don't know if that's pacifism in some definitions, but for me, that active, courageous response to violence is what Christian peace is about.
That's great, thank you. I think also the really good thing with the Christian campaign for nuclear disarmament is it makes us think about what peace actually is as well, so not just what pacifism is, but if we're in a time of relative peace where there are few wars happening and there are still nuclear weapons around, it makes us think about what that threat means and how that will impact us if there is something that goes wrong in terms of safety or there's a failure of some kind, and just the constant threat of war that exists as a result of that. But I'm sure we'll come on to all of that in your workshop later on. So if you can pass the microphone on to Sue, if you want to answer the question of, does Christian peace mean pacifism?
Thank you. So my name's Sue, and I work for Embrace the Middle East, which is a Christian development charity that works in Israel, Palestine, Egypt, Iraq, Syria, and Lebanon. But my particular interest is in Israel and Palestine. So I'm doing a lot of thinking about what it means to be a Christian peacemaker in that context. But for me, it all begins with who we are and the inner journey. And I want to begin by just telling you a story. My children are grown up now, but when I had my first child, I was in the hospital with her and I had fallen asleep with her in the crook of my arm. A member of staff came to lift her, to put her back in what I call the little fish tanks that they have in maternity hospitals. I kind of came to, and my response, I had to apologize to this poor woman later on because I literally growled at her. My response was not one of peace, it was one of heightened alert, and I would have hurt her if I thought she was going to snatch my baby from me. Just a couple of weeks later, we were then traveling in the car and down a narrow country lane, and there was somebody ahead who decided to take that moment to overtake the car in front of them. They were coming straight at us, and I remember flinging myself over her car seat. So in that space of 2 weeks, I realized that number one, I would be prepared to hurt somebody to protect my child. And secondly, I would be prepared to die for my child. That set off a whole train of thoughts, and I've been reflecting on it ever since, recognizing that how I respond to situations of conflict actually begins with my inner journey. And so I've done quite a lot of reflecting actually on the story of the death and resurrection of Jesus. What did it mean that Jesus lived a violent death? And was that as a consequence of human action and sin, or was it as a consequence of God's wrath? And that's a really, really important question to reflect on and answer on. And later on in the workshop about justice and peace, we will have the opportunity to unpack that a little more. So that's all really to say that I think the answer is complicated, but peace begins with our inner journey.
Thank you very much for those personal reflections, and also just for reminding us that in amongst all the activism that a lot of people in this room take part in and are involved in, there is that need to recognise the place of the inner journey, especially when it is very easy to fall into cynicism or being burnt out in these spaces. So I look forward to hearing more on that. So Katrina, do you want to tell us a little bit about your answer on does Christian peace mean pacifism?
Thank you, William. I'm Katrina, and until recently, well, until last year, I was the warden of Iona Abbey up on the west coast of Scotland on a wee island where the Iona Community has a group living in the Abbey, living in intentional community. And now I'm back in London, but I'm originally from Scotland. And it's good to see a few Kent faces here. What kind of world does God intend? And the founder of the Iona Community, George MacLeod, came back from the First World War, a long time ago now, a decorated soldier, but also absolutely horrified at the death and destruction that he had witnessed, and convinced that there must be a better way to resolve differences, even big differences. And we've heard about some of those already. So peace rooted in justice became incredibly important to him. And as a Church of Scotland minister, he brought together young academics, theologians, trainee ministers to live and work alongside one another and alongside unemployed stonemasons, carpenters, electricians from the poor part of Glasgow during the Depression in the 30s, the late 30s. And together, living together, working together, eating meals together, worshipping together, and learning from one another, they rebuilt Iona Abbey from a ruin, and they rebuilt community intentionally. And the Iona Community today continues this tradition of intentional community, learning through doing. So we're very keen on practice. We can assert all we like, but what do we actually do? How do we live our lives? So when we disagree, we try to turn towards each other, not away from one another. And we emphasize practice, and we do doing peace by committing ourselves to community life and by being accountable to one another. So there's lots of meeting up and lots of chatting and lots of meals together, whereby we account for our lives and account for the way we live peaceably and impeaceably. None of us are perfect. And reconciliation is only possible when we turn towards our opponents, recognizing their humanity, listening deeply to their concerns, not in order to agree with them, but to understand better and to be open to change within ourselves. It's not easy, either on a personal level, and anybody who's ever been a flatmate or lived in a family, we all know it's not easy, or on the international stage. And a non-violent approach needs as much work, resources, and preparation, in fact, more work, resources, and preparation than violent conflict to be effective. And the Iona Community supports the United Nations internationally. It needs huge amounts of effort and thought and organisation to enable us to live peacefully across the world. The Iona Community, we don't separate work from worship, prayer from politics, the sacred from the secular. We name injustice and we pursue peace. Our liturgy is earthy, grounded in the reality of today's messy world. And we lift our eyes to the hills and the promise of a world that God intended.
The Iona Community is another great example of the theme of the gathering today, the inner peace and outer pacifism, the joining together of the spiritual journey of discipleship and following in the way of Jesus and the way of peacemaking, as well as those activist strands. And I know of in Iona Abbey, you have the cat and the monkey that is carved into the walls, representing both the active way of life as a Christian and then also the contemplative and meditative way of life as a Christian, and need to combine the two in the work that we do. But thank you all for your responses just now. What we are going to do is open it up to questions from everyone. I will come round with this mic so that you can be heard on the live stream. Unless you do not want to be heard, then just let me know. And yeah, we'll open it up. Either one or all of you can answer it depending on what the question is. Does anyone have any initial questions?
A question for, sorry, I forgot your name, from the Iona Community.
Katrina.
Katrina. Mm-hmm. You talked about peace rooted in justice, and I'm curious about whether you think a commitment to ideas of justice can stand in the way of peace, especially when compromise seems to be required. So thinking about like international events, it seems like the only way you will get peace in Israel-Palestine is through both sides giving up strong commitments to justice, say like the Zionists giving up like illegal border territories as they see as like just as it's their land, and also Palestinians giving up a right to return to like pre-67 or possibly even like pre-48 borders. So do you think there can be cases where Christian conceptions of justice are actually in conflict with Christian roots to peace in meaningful ways?
What was your name?
Rue.
Rue. Thank you, Rue. Just dive straight in there. I think there is a tension, and I know I've experienced that tension just in amongst friendships, let alone Israel-Palestine, of how far do you go? Do you have a red line? But I think for me, and probably for many of the Iona community, it's being open and realizing that other people do have legitimate, your opponents, your enemies, have legitimate concerns, have something to fight for if they're fighting, or to be protesting against if they're protesting, and to open that up as far as possible. It's certainly not, peace is certainly not just the absence of violence, and we all know that just festers. It's just, I don't think anybody in the Iona community is at all interested in that. So it's a question of communicating, and how hard that is, from, on your local council to the international stage, how hard that is to really look into somebody's eyes and to say, can we do better than this? Can we do better than this? Who needs to be in the room? Who's not in the room? Who needs to be part of this conversation in order to get justice and enough peace, enough justice to move forward bit by bit? But it's not easy.
Sue, I think you would have some valuable insights for that question too.
Yeah, so another part of what I do is I'm also a priest at Coventry Cathedral, and Coventry Cathedral is the centre for the community of the Cross of Nails, which is now a worldwide movement of people working together towards reconciliation and peace. And it has three objectives. The first is healing the wounds of history. The second is learning to live with difference and celebrating diversity. And the third is building a culture of justice and peace. Now, until very recently, that third one was just building a culture of peace. But it was recognized, as already has just been said, you can't have, peace is so much more than the absence of violence. And it's very difficult to have a true peace without justice. But those three sort of aims indicate that this is fluid, it's a movement, and it doesn't all happen at once. It's actually an ongoing process that has to recognize that wounds often fester. So what do we do to heal wounds? Do we contribute to the festering, or do we apply healing balm? And actually learning to live with difference, that's a challenge for all of us, because everybody that we meet will be different to us. So how do we then learn to live with that difference and then celebrate that diversity? And again, this is fluid, it's a process. And that can then actually lead us to begin to walk together towards building justice and peace. But as you've already said, it requires really, really deep listening. And actually somebody once said to me that if you really do have a reconciling heart, your own side will probably believe that you have betrayed them. So there's also that whole thing about taking risks and being brave. It's not straightforward, it's not easy, but the conflicts that we are facing, and particularly when we look at Israel-Palestine, Rue, they compel us to start walking on that journey.
Well, shall I add something?
If you would like. Yeah.
I was just thinking about a different conflict, and that was in the massacre in Srebrenica during the Bosnian War. And I was reading a really interesting article one time about when that massacre happened, families were sheltering in a UN compound, and the Dutch-backed troops made some kind of agreement with the army that was surrounding them that the Dutch-backed troops would leave and no longer protect these civilians. And the civilians were appalled, but the Dutch-backed troops, they were peacekeepers, I think, and they didn't have permission to use arms in that situation. And that aggressive army came in and they took all the men and they massacred them. And more recently, there was an exhibition in Srebrenica about this massacre, and the article was talking about how the widows of those men could not forgive these troops for leaving them to have their men massacred. They knew that was going to happen. And the troops just felt such pain about it, felt that they had no other choice. And they wanted to be forgiven by these women, and they wanted everything to be all right now. And it wasn't. The women, they had lost their sons and husbands and the fathers of their children, and they were not able to think that everything was okay now. And so everyone in that situation, they just had to live with this pain and live with this difference. And it was represented in this amazing exhibition. And I think, when you're talking about justice, I think it can be really tempting to think that we can tick that's done, and now everything's even. But human situations where there has been conflict, I think the healing is something that, there might not be enough time in the world for that to really take place. And sometimes it is about just accepting that these awful things have happened and we've been part of it.
Thanks everyone for the responses, and thanks Ruth for the question. We have had, before we go on to any of the next questions, John Cooper from Fellowship of Reconciliation has arrived. So we will let John give a brief introduction to himself, and if you can answer the question in around about 2 minutes of what does Christian peace mean pacifism?
Okay, so good morning everyone. My name's John. I've just made it here from Birmingham via Nuneaton, Rugby, and then an overloaded train that then had to go slow. So I think we're all being told to slow down and take a breath and then see what emerges. I have the privilege of leading the Fellowship of Reconciliation in England and Scotland. The fellowship was formed in 1914 when, among other things, a German and an Englishman shook hands on Cologne railway platform as the guns of war were firing in August and said, "We're one in Christ and we'll never be at war." And ever since that moment, it has kept alive a Christian commitment to peace, which expanded to justice and non-violence, as a way not just of simply renouncing war, but turning our attention instead to something else, to something better. We spawned, as we were the founding branch, a global movement which has branches, sister branches, in 4 continents of the world. 7 or 9 Nobel Peace Prize nominees or winners among our global fellowship. We supported and had membership of Martin Luther King Jr. in the USA, who's spoken out on racism, on climate change, on all sorts. And it's a privilege to just be there for a few years in its bigger story. The question, our testimony to the answer is yes.
Yeah. A very good answer.
Does Christian peace mean pacifism? Yes. And I think there are 3 main things I'll try and squeeze into 2 minutes. First, it means pacifism because Christianity is about love. And if you love someone or something, fundamentally, you cannot hurt it and kill it. And the moment you decide you can kill someone or something, you are deciding you are better than them. And your life and your right is more important than that other person. Second is that this commitment to love isn't just some nice, comfy ideal, probably dreamt up in, I don't know, Hampstead by white men with beards and, well, I've got away with it. I've not got sandals on today. It's there in Scripture. If you look from the 10 Commandments, thou shalt not kill, that's pretty clear, even in the Bible, which at times can make a right old hash of stuff, short sentence, you know what you get with it. And that one sentence spawned conscientious objection, which is still a vibrant and alive issue for people today. People who read Scripture and say, it tells me not to kill. The state is telling me to kill. Therefore, actually, I follow God, not the state. So I'm going to try and walk another way. It's also there if you look at the life and ministry of Jesus, which, you know, for better or worse, I hope we all try and emulate. Look at what his life of love in action was all about. He liberated spaces not by hitting people, but by drawing other people in. He turned over expectation by reaching out to those who were not allowed to say, in my kingdom, you are part, you are loved. And when he sat down with those who set the rules, he said, don't look at what the words say, look at the spirit, look at the meaning, and look what it delivers. And this was all fairly transformative, even more so. And this is the third reason why I think Christianity peacemaking naturally leads to pacifism, is people can often think that peace and non-violence is quite a nice thing. The sort of thing a bit like, you know, Mrs. Miggin's jam at the summer fair. You like it, but probably only if you don't have to make the jam yourself. Peace is great when you're not at war. Yet Jesus' transformative message came about in an era of intense military occupation. And if the heart of the Christian message was not just about rendering to God all that was God's, but also about overthrowing the Roman state, surely Jesus would have spent a bit more of his ministry building up a physical army. When it came to that moment in the Garden of Gethsemane, just before he was going to be put on the cross, which he knew was going to happen, because he knew half his life had been told in advance. He said, put away the sword. Now, most of us, including myself, probably won't ever know what we'd do if we're faced with someone with a weapon in our face. But could we honestly say, put down the sword? I'm on the side that says, I hope I would, and I'll give my life to trying to see and help others think that way, and hopefully we'll never have to put it to the test. Yeah. I'm sure other stuff's come up in the questions, so I've shortened it.
Yeah, thank you so much. Yeah, so we'll open it back up to questions just now. I believe I had seen one just up the back before, and then we'll come back round to the front here. Do you still have a question?
Yes, please. Hi, yeah. So I just wanted to push into Matthew 5 more, actually. So Matthew 5, I think 40 is the turn the other cheek, but I read the kind of chapter surrounding it, and it's not just that one verse. Jesus goes on to say, and give them your coat, and walk the second mile, love thy enemies, and God reigns on, like God makes rain, as in literal rain, on the righteous and the unrighteous. And I think that makes it really, really strong. And I don't think, just to be clear, I don't think you were trying to do this, but I think if I took you at face value and bought what you were saying about turning the other cheek, that actually it's a positive action, that it doesn't mean being a doormat, it doesn't mean being, you know, not taking any action whatsoever, then I would probably open the Bible, read it, and then be shocked to find that actually, no, Jesus doesn't leave it at that one line. He really pushes in and repeats the motif over and over. So I guess, yeah, my question would be to really drill down on what actually are the positive actions that are within the remit of pacifism. Like, can we get maybe more concrete lines around this idea of what is pacifism? Is there any violence whatsoever in pacifism? You know, what kind of justifies it?
So I believe it would be Teresa first, since you brought up the Matthew 5 passage.
Thank you, Anna. Yes, I'm aware of those other examples, and I think you're right. Jesus does kind of go into more detail there, and so does Walter Wink about those examples. But I won't bore you. So the question of violence and pacifism. That's why I started off by saying it depends on your definition there, because I think Christian people, and I think we've already seen it a little bit here, are quite nervous about saying no violence ever, because we can see situations where we might react with violence. So I don't really know the answer to your question. I know that there are many positive things that we can do in the peace movement, that we do, positive actions we can take. But I struggle myself with saying that no violence ever is acceptable in the name of Christianity. I struggle with it, honestly. So, for example, I was reading something one time. A woman, this is a woman wrote a little book about her experience. She had been on holiday in Kenya with her husband, and they were attacked by Somali pirates who shot her husband, and she was taken into Somalia and held captive for, I think, a year before finally being released. And, her family here had to raise millions of pounds as a ransom, I believe. And I remember thinking, if SAS forces, if I was in that situation, SAS forces came down from a helicopter to rescue me and shot one of those kidnappers, part of me wouldn't mind. Part of me would think, thank God I'm out of here, this is awful. So I don't have a clear answer for you myself. That's part of my journey, is examining all of that. And just to share another element of my journey, one of my sons is in the Marines. Some people will be tired of me saying this, but one of my sons is in the Royal Marines, and I could not believe that one of my children was going to join the armed forces, being a person of non-violence myself, and I struggled so much with that, and I tried to talk him out of it, believe me, but he doesn't listen to his mother. And I have had to learn over time to talk to my son and not just jump down his throat at everything. I've had to learn to find a way to talk to him that doesn't just lead to arguments, because he feels that there is something about his work which is about keeping the peace. I don't agree with him, but I have to recognise that he's coming from a place where he thinks he is doing something good and right, and there may be some times in which what he's doing is good and right. I couldn't really mark that out for you. So sorry, it's a bit woolly, but that's where I am.
Would anyone else like to respond to that question?
I think it's a really, really good question. But I think what Matthew 5 does for us is it gives us a wider context about this process of peace building, because actually we all have the capacity to set a tone, don't we? So we all know of situations perhaps that we've been in where perhaps somebody is behaving in a very aggressive way and you can see the atmosphere sort of deteriorate, or if you're in a situation where somebody behaves in a really positive and affirming way, then that also rubs off. And so it's back to John's point about occupation. So Jesus was in a time of Roman occupation. And what a Roman soldier could do is just pick anybody up off the street and make them carry their backpack. And they could make them carry it for a mile. And so here's Jesus saying, if that happens to you, be generous. Be really generous and carry the backpack for two. You start to set a tone, and could you just imagine for a minute if you've got this really, aggressive soldier who can make you carry the backpack, and you go, no, I'll carry it for 2 miles for you. You've completely disarmed that soldier, really, and would probably make them really, really think and question their own behaviour. So again, it's a really good example of how we are invited to be different, to live differently. It's all part of that process of peace building.
As you were talking, I was reminded of a conversation I was in earlier this week where we were exploring non-violent alternatives to the war in Ukraine. So quite an easy thing to cover in an hour on a webinar on a Monday evening. And one of the stories that one of the long-term non-violence trainers from Northern Ireland told was one that he'd learnt from someone who'd been involved in interrogating Nazi high officials at the end of the Second World War. And they were disarmed because instead of being tortured, they were treated as humans, as a way to get the information. And if you read in more detail, what you actually find is Trent Park up in North London was heavily bugged. It was like a country house that Middlesex Uni had for many years. And it was heavily bugged, and they just let them sit and drink tea and chat among themselves and listened in. And it was about changing the expectations. But I think it is worth saying at this point, if you say to someone pacifist, people assume passive, inactive. Part of the reason I get energized about it is actually it's an incredibly active thing. So I'm hoping to go and interview later this year one of our members who's, let's just say, on the older side of life, who was a conscientious objector in the Second World War and spent most of his time defusing and decommissioning bombs that had fallen on the ground in the UK. Or you go and you meet someone like Norman Kember, a former trustee of the fellowship, who was in exactly the situation that Theresa outlined in the build-up to the Iraq War, who went on a humanitarian mission to Iraq to continue to build bridges, even as the then Labour Prime Minister Tony Blair talked war. And he was taken hostage, and one of their members of the team was killed, and he was rescued by special forces. And that did throw open huge moral questions, and I don't have his sort of testimony about the situation in front of me. But I think if we view pacifism as a rejection of violence as the answer, we then get to the heart of some of what you were explaining about the long work of peace, and is at the heart of that changing of expectations within Matthew 5. If we believe blessed are the peacemakers, what are our actions going to be that we want to be that bring blessing to others? It can simply be opening the doors to those who are fleeing from violence as refugees, or it might be going in, as Gene Sharp says, gumming up the system by taking part in non-violent direct action. There's a huge spectrum. The challenge is, it's not just about saying no to war, it's about saying, here's what I'll do next.
Yeah. Katrina, apologies if you wanted to respond to that, but I want to try and get in a couple more questions, if that's all right. So I'll open it up to probably 2 more questions, and if we can just get 2 responses for each of them, then that'd be great. So go with Bella.
Hi. I actually just want to push back a bit on some of the stuff we've been saying. We've talked a lot about listening and reconciliation, but can we really apply that to a context like Palestine, in which Palestinians have been living through settler colonialism, apartheid and genocide for 80 years? I think buying into the idea that this is complex and that dialogue will help or be the solution, and that's our role as Christians, overlooks the fundamental power difference between colonizer and colonized. And Zionism is fundamentally a genocidal ideology, so can you really compromise on that? And I thought bringing up the example of Nazis was really interesting. It's great that they were treated with respect, and that's right, because every human life is inherently valuable. But that was after they were crushed from power. There's no way that Jewish people could disarm their way by, carrying bags generously in death camps. So that's my question.
Who would like to take that first? Yeah.
Seem to be holding the mic again. I think first I would say we don't do any of this work alone. We are in solidarity. We have each other. And as Christians, we're in solidarity with God. And the Iona Community has a very strong statement on Israel-Palestine. Do find it online. It's active. There are lots of non-violent ways to pursue peace that are outlined in that, and many Iona Community members and associates are heavily involved in that side of things. I think I'm saddened but not surprised. A friend of mine who was part of the peace movement in Ukraine before the war now says she's had it with peace. It's too painful. It's too horrible, and she doesn't believe in it any longer. And I think we have an interview with one of the hostages who released from Gaza, who was saying the same thing. A peace activist all her life, and no. So I'm in a very privileged position. I speak to Germans and Poles about Ukraine, Russia. I don't feel that existential, threat. I don't think them now, me next, because I'm in Britain. I've got a huge kind of protection in so many ways, not geographical, but in lots of ways. So I'm cautious to speak for people in a very different circumstance from me. But I would say this is structural, and Jesus was structural. It wasn't just a question of wandering around doing little bits of this and that. It was calling for a new way that together we live our lives with the planet, with each other, and that requires, as I said before, a huge amount of work, preparation, thought, energy, excitement, love. And when things have got to this very bad state of extreme violence, we need to learn from that. And that's why you have people saying when they're sick to death of wars, never again. And this 20th century was industrialized war. And a lot of people, the EU, These, Iona Community, Agape, all these communities started up saying, no, we just don't want to, we never want that to happen again.
I'd just like to respond to what you were saying about settler colonialism, and really to give you just a couple of examples of different organisations that have taken different approaches to this. So there is one organisation in the sort of Israel-Palestine space that has brought together people who live in West Bank villages with settlers from the settlements, and brought them together for dialogue. Now, I've been to some of their events and I've listened to their speakers, and, it's on the surface, it looks really, really great because you've got people on different sides of this conflict, actually developing friendships and getting to know one another. My difficulty with that is that it actually doesn't challenge the fundamental injustice that is the root of the problem. So another organisation that Embrace the Middle East partners with is one called Musalaha, Arabic word for reconciliation. And that too wants to bring together Palestinians with Israelis in dialogue. However, there is a caveat to that, and that's a recognition that those coming from Israel need to recognize and understand the structural and fundamental injustice of the settler colonial project. So just recently, Musalaha has taken a real leap of faith and has actually employed as one of their key workers a woman who is both Israeli and Jewish. And she has come into that space to work alongside a Christian Palestinian. And their particular task is going to be working on reconciliation amongst women. And there has, in that development of that relationship and partnership, been a requirement for some really, really deep listening that is beginning to change both of them. And so one of the things that the Palestinian woman has begun to understand is that still, because the Holocaust is still in living memory, that any kind of rejection of a Jewish state is so profoundly and disturbingly difficult for Israelis. But then the Jewish woman, the Jewish Israeli woman, has begun to really understand the impact of a settler colonial project on flourishing, life, and the whole impact that that has on the Palestinian community, including, of course, access to things as practical as electricity and water. So the deep listening is possible whilst also recognizing the fundamental injustice. And I really do passionately believe that that's the route that we have to go down, even though it is profoundly difficult and challenging.
Okay, we'll have to just go for one more question, and then we'll open it up to 2 responses again. So I'm sure we'll get lots of time to continue to talk about all of this throughout the workshops through the day. But to round off the panel, we'll allow for one more question. Yep.
Thank you. I've got a quote from Noam Chomsky, who we all thought was dead, but actually still alive. Chomsky talked about, and this isn't dissimilar to what you were saying, Bella. I've got 2 points. Chomsky talked about kind of the alienation that people have from thinking about these big issues of peace and justice, and that our politics can make it seem so ridiculously complicated that normal people shouldn't get involved because we're never going to kind of understand it. And Chomsky very much was against that, and he was like, every single person is complicit and every single person needs to be involved in these larger movements to peace. And I think what's connected with that, my second point, is that our society has misinterpreted what peace looks like and what is seen as violent. So for instance, like the Palestine protests were always called violent, but of course they were working to dismantle the structural violence that continues to keep Palestine under occupation and continues to privilege Israel. And so I think we're in a place where people and individuals are so scared to be labelled violent we live in a violent society, that almost like working towards peace seems completely improbable and something that we're not meant to be involved in. So that seems like a very big question. But I feel a bit like talking about reconciliation is really important, and that almost like is the end, that is the goal, but the kind of start, I think most people in our society don't even have the consciousness of understanding that this is something that they should be involved in, this is something they should be thinking about, let alone like promoting. And how on earth do we get to a place of, so I'm talking too long, but how do we get to a place of like encouraging people to even start beginning thinking about this journey before we get into these like deep developments of what eventual peace might look like?
Thank you. Yes. One of the things I was thinking when people were answering before is that, and it kind of is about what you're saying, that part of the work of peace, for those of us involved in peace, which should be all Christians, right? Part of the work is about, like you've seen, wrestling with these really difficult questions and trying to think what is the right thing here, what is the best way, who needs to be in this conversation. All of that wrestling and thinking about how does this connect with this and what about that. That is the work of peace. And so, like Chomsky says, we can all be engaged in that, and we kind of are all engaged in it. Also, as people have been saying, some of it is about myself and how I am with other people, and how hard that is even in a one-to-one situation with, members of my own family or people I'm sharing a flat with or whatever. All of those things. So it is the work that we're all engaged in, actually small scale, and we maybe don't recognise that is also the same struggle scaled up, across nations and internationally. It's the same kind of pressures. And so we can, like Chomsky says, we can all be part of that. We can all identify with some of those difficulties. I'm not sure if it's Chomsky or someone else who talks about how I can recognise in my own life, if my next door neighbour is driving me crazy, I can't go round there and bomb their kitchen. I have to talk to them about that or try and ignore it. But somehow, between countries, we haven't recognised that I can't actually go and bomb somebody else's country either. That somehow we've, like you say, we're living in a violent society that we're calling it peace. And actually, there's so much internationally that is acceptable in a way that, as Christians, I think we should challenge. And I think we kind of do struggle with how to do that. So that's my rambly answer to your rambly question. I hope that's okay.
So I think, first of all, I'll be shameless and say every Christian should join the Fellowship of Reconciliation, because that's our life work, to help broadcast a message of peace in a world that finds it incredibly easy to talk war. And what that peace looks like can be social peace, which is why we helped shape the founder of the Iona Community. It's why we've been found in all sorts of places at all sorts of times. But there's a few different things. My starting point is this. An apple will always fall from a tree, whether Isaac Newton sat under it or not. A bomb only falls from a plane because someone has built it, someone has flown it, or sat at a desk and driven it, and someone has decided it needs to be fired. Therefore, it should be our life's work to stop that from happening, because war is not natural. It is not the answer. And even in painful situations like Palestine, where you see people oppressed, dehumanized, in a world that seems happy to fuel the war, our voice is not to speak necessarily as the majority, but to speak up for lasting justice. And that includes for human rights, which are one of the first things usually thrown on the bonfire when war breaks out. We need to be upholding institutions that hold all to account and say, actually, no matter who you are and what you've done, you now need to answer. And if some of that means to say sorry, it means saying sorry. If some of that means time in jail, it means time in jail. But also we need to recognize that within the UK, we are complicit in so many wars around the world. People march on the streets to say, stop the bombing in Gaza, and yet it is British-made components that are in the jets that are flying over Gaza at the moment, and we don't turn attention to that. We see our governments of various stripes want to increase military spending to at least 2.5% of GDP, which sounds like, oh, well, how's much? Well, it's about £100,000 a minute that our government wants to put towards warfare. Much more than it wants to invest in the social good of international development. Much more probably than various other security and other long-term peace-building support. And in a world that talks war, our calling is to talk peace. It's to name the systems and structures. And when we face situations of immense oppression, it's about saying, well, what has happened elsewhere? So within the history of the fellowship, there are some amazing stories, including in France, in Vichy, France, one of the most horrific and horrid occupations that happened in Western Europe under the Nazi era, where a French government aped the Germans who they were operating on behalf of. And there was a small French community that, under the leadership of a dynamic duo, a pastor and his wife, Trockheim, decided, we're not going to do this. We're not going to go along with this. And they hid about 5,000 Jewish people safely in their village. And they are now recognized as, I think, is it hero among nations? Righteous among nations for their effort. It's like the school teachers in Denmark who worked together to ensure the entire Jewish population were not deported, and instead they put them in boats and safely moved them to a neutral country. We can make war and peace complicated, or we can focus on building peace.
Well, thank you to everyone who's asked questions and given responses, and also a massive thank you to our panel for today. So,
I'll just add my thanks and also tell you the phone call that I rushed out to take may have provoked some violent thoughts in my mind, as it was Pret cancelling lunch. However, we're seeking a non-violent solution. And Naomi O is out the back dealing with that now. But lunch may end up being not entirely as planned. We might have a first course of crisps and then perhaps some pizza after. We're going to come up with something, I promise. The thing that I wanted to say, as we go from the panel now into individual workshops to try and drill down into these difficult questions, the challenging questions, you will have seen this, that setting the tone is a little bit unusual for a day conference to not have a really clear thread that you want everybody to agree on by the end of the day. The thing is, amongst our panelists, even within our panelists, let alone within us, there is complex and contradictory stuff kind of going on in us. And what we wanted to do is spend today facing that. The reality of committing ourselves to peace has been challenged by first the war in Ukraine and now in Israel and Gaza. It ought to always challenge us, but these things have come closer to us than for some of us perhaps in our lifetimes. And And you are not going to go away today with a pocket full of easy answers. And I hope that challenge stimulates you rather than frustrates you. And it's a bit of a different thing to do with the day. But it's really easy to, just as Christians, say, oh, well, we're not going to talk about it because we're not going to get to a solution. We're not going to come to what's an SCM view on this? Or that I know that people will go away today perhaps less sure of what they think rather than more sure. But I think what we're trying to do is to face the reality of the world that we live in with honesty about what's hard. And the other thing I just wanted to say, I wanted to do a little advert for a speaker that we had a few years ago at a national gathering, a couple of years ago. His name's Alec Ryrie, and I expect if I ask her nicely, Ruth will repost the YouTube link to that talk. It might be something to follow up with afterwards. The thing that he talked about that speaks into this conversation today, and I think really helps with some of the questions that you were all asking. It doesn't answer them, but it helps us think about them, is that we have been tricked into thinking that peace is complicated and war is simple. And we've been tricked into thinking that because of the stories that we tell in our culture. And what Alec Ryrie's talk is about how the dominant story of our culture used to be the story of Jesus, and it's become the story of Hitler. And if you look at the way we tell stories, we tell the story of the Second World War over and over and over again, and we mimic it in other stories. And there's something there about the way that when we tell a story, it has a beginning, a middle, and an end, and it has a resolution. And so we're being constantly bombarded with the idea that if we take up arms, we will get to a secure solution. And the thing is that what we've heard from our panelists is that peace is messy and contradictory. And the thing that I was thinking about while we were talking about that was that I've been challenged to remember that war and violence is contradictory and it's messy. It isn't any easier and it isn't any simpler. But we're constantly being bombarded with the idea that it will make a resolution, that it will redeem us. So I really recommend that talk to you. He says that a great deal better than I did, and with pictures. In a moment, I'm going to go and work with Naomi O on trying to make sure that we get some lunch. And in the meantime, I'm going to hand over to Sue, who is going to lead us in our first workshop.